Our friend Kyle Kalinske over at Secular Talk recently did a piece about reparations, the United Nations saying that they believe African Americans are owed reparations in the United States. Kyle is getting clobbered by some people for his commentary. Let's take a look at some of what he had to say.
The United Nations weighed in on the state of race relations in the U.S., and they had some pretty harsh things to say. So first and foremost, they said that the U.S. owes black people reparations for slavery. Now, what led them to, having this conversation or releasing the statements that they released is, of course, the slew of unarmed black people who have been killed in the U.S. So they came out and said, you know what, you still owe reparations for slavery. And they also, quote, expressed concern over the unresolved legacy of colonial history, enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality. Now, I should be clear, though, and mention that what they mean by reparations is pretty vague and pretty unclear. And in fact, if anything, they allude to it not being what you think it is. They say it may include, quote, elements of an apology and a form of debt relief to the descendants of enslaved people. But on the one hand, you look at it and look, it's fair to say, I never fucking owned slaves. No living white person in the United States owned slaves. And no living black person in the United States right now was a slave. So, one argument is that's not like, what are you going to do? Like, punish people who had nothing to do with it and reward people who had nothing to do with it and have no firsthand experience? That's one argument. But on the other hand, the argument would be, well, look, the U.S. did 245 years of slavery where black people were just literally treated as property, and they were property in the eyes of the law. Then they promised them compensation in the form of 40 acres and a mule. They never gave them shit. There was also, 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow after that. And then blacks have only been free on paper all across America for 50 years, right? So about 1965 is when we're talking, then is segregation. And it's not like, by the way, okay, segregation is over and now everybody all of a sudden views everybody in an egalitarian way and everybody's equal. Like, that didn't happen. We wish that was the case. On paper, it was the case. Like, okay, now everybody's equal. But look, that wasn't the mentality. So you had 65, 75, 85, 95, 2005, 2015. Yeah, so about 50 years, a little over 50 years is how long on paper. So, I mean, if you really look at the scope of it, slavery went on for a really long time. Jim Crow and segregation went on for a really long time. And we're still, like, in the baby phase of, on paper even, having free black people all around America. And then, obviously, you bring up the aspect of mass incarceration, and you go, well, how really free are not only people of color in this country, but also poor white people in this country when it comes to the drug war? So black people, minorities are disproportionately targeted, but there are also a lot of poor white people who are in jail as a result of criminalizing substances. And make no mistake about it, the history of it is you do that to police the undesirables. So, okay, so we're going to ban this substance because it turns out Hispanics use this substance. You're going to ban that substance because it turns out blacks use this substance. So, that the net effect of that is, that's why some people call it the new Jim Crow, is, you criminalize these poor communities and it perpetuates this system of the rich staying rich and then, the poor staying poor. So now, again, people could still look at that argument and they go, okay, but still today, no white people that are alive were slave owners, no black people were slaves, so the whole conversation is an unfair conversation. Why are we even having it? That's the argument some people would make. But again, the counter-argument to that is the effects of that system, which existed for so long, we are still feeling today.
So a lot of people are reacting and saying, wait a second. As Kyle is pointing out, Nobody alive today in the U.S. owned slaves. Nobody alive today in the U.S. was owned as a slave by American slave owners. So why are reparations necessary here? Other people reacting, I received a few emails from people saying, wait a second, David. If we are going to talk about reparations for African Americans in the U.S. today, we need to go further back. We can find many other individuals who are owed reparations for things that have happened in the past. I think that we need to look at this from a couple of different perspectives here. Okay, there are basically two arguments, and Kyle did a really good job of distilling these. Number one is this does not apply to people alive today, thus there should be no reparations. The other argument, and this is an argument that really requires thinking it through to figure out what it is that we're saying, is that there are still repercussions to the fact that we had years and years and years of slavery in the United States. One of my favorite examples that explains this is if you imagine the board game Monopoly, right? You sit around with two other friends and you start the game. None of the properties are owned. Everybody starts with the same amount of money. You play for an hour. Many of the properties have been purchased. Many of the cards that you uncover and you get windfalls, whatever, those have been acquired. And a fourth player enters the game. That fourth player is given the same amount of money that everybody else started with, is allowed to take turns the same way everybody else is allowed to take turns. And you could say, listen, on paper, everybody's playing by the same rules, right? Same amount of starting cash. You can buy properties if you land on them. If you land on properties that are owned, you've got to pay rent based on the number of houses and hotels, right? The rules are the same for every player. But clearly, that fourth player is at a major disadvantage by virtue of having started later. And that's really what Kyle is getting at here when he says, well, yeah, nobody alive today was either slave owner or slave in the history of the United States, but we have measurable differences in terms of how different populations are living today as a result of the fact that we had, and you don't even have to go back to slavery. Interestingly, you can go back only 50 years to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, prior to which we had all sorts of established discrimination against Black Americans. So that, I think, is a perfectly legitimate point of view for Kyle to take. Let's take it a little bit further here. What about the idea of reparations or settlements or money being paid out by individuals who were not directly involved in a transgression and being received by individuals who were not directly personally involved in that transgression? This is very common, right? Family members of people who died from cigarette smoking regularly sue cigarette companies. And you may have executives at the cigarette company at the time who were not involved in the cigarette production at the time that this individual died. And you've got family members who were not the people who did the smoking, who are the ones receiving the money from the settlement. That exists. That's a common thing in society. So the idea that there's something completely unprecedented and unique about individuals who were not the slaves receiving money, there's absolutely nothing odd about that. Now, you might disagree with it, and then you would have to justify why you are against it in all cases. But to say, well, I'm against it only when it comes to the long-lasting impact of systemic and established discrimination in the United States, that's a different story. The bottom line for me is I have no problem at all with the idea that reparations may be in order here. It's a defensible opinion. However, it applies to more than just Black people in the United States. And I think the problematic aspect would be cherry picking and saying, of all the populations around the world, the only ones who at this point deserve reparations for something that happened in the past are Black people in the United States. To be clear, the UN was not saying at the exclusion of every other group, only Black people require or warrant or deserve reparations. They were saying, we believe in this particular case, Black people deserve reparations. I think if you look at the comments on Kyle's video, which we are linking to, a lot of the people slamming him have no clue what on earth they're talking about.